Welcome to the OC24 podcast, where we've taken some of the best talks and discussions from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime, which showcases some of the most interesting research into organised crime around the world. This episode is called Organised Crime and Animals.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Welcome to our panel today on organised crime and animals. My name is Daan van Uhm, and I'm a criminologist from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And this panel is part of a special issue edited by me and Professor Dina Siegel that will be published this month in the journal Trends in Organized Crime. And this special issue contributes to the criminological literature on organized crime, new illicit markets, and green criminology. The articles offer a wide range of empirical evidence, criminological analysis, and theoretical explorations of various connections between, on the one hand, organized crime, and on the other hand, animals, including the illegal wildlife trade, gambling on animals, puppy trafficking, the killing of wolves, and illegal unreported fisheries, and the regulatory and enforcement responses to these phenomena. And in this panel, authors, part of the special issue, will introduce themselves and present their amazing work. So I'm very excited to be here today. And we will start today with a presentation from Aitor Alonso. Then we are going to continue with a presentation by me. And then after that, we have a presentation of Andrea Stefanus. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat so that we can see them immediately on the screen. Or we are going to respond to that after each presentation or after all the presentations. Depends a little bit of our time schedule and also a little bit about the questions, of course. Well, thanks again for being with us. And Aitor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for this opportunity to be here. Hi, everyone, attending this session, very early session here in Europe. I am Aitor Ibáñez Alonso. I am master graduate from Utrecht University with a thesis in the illegal trade in European eels under the supervision of Daan van Uhm. And right now I am working as a research consultant at C4NDAs in Washington. And at the same time, I'm looking for PhD opportunities in the field of green criminology. So the legal trade, we have the slides, please. Yes, thank you. Yeah, can we pass the next one? Yes. So the legal trade in totoaba swim bladder is a serious wildlife crime that starts in the states of Baja California and Sonora in Mexico, and ends in the USA and several Asian countries, mainly China. And this has become a hot topic in recent years, mainly after the release of the documentary of National Geographic of Sea of Shadows that exposed to the general public all the harms of this environmental issue, including, of course, the involvement of Mexican drug cartels inside the trafficking chain. And in this sense, the convergence between green crimes and other serious crime has also become a trending issue, not only within the criminological studies, but also we had this year various NGO reports, like the one from the Wildlife Justice Commissioner. So I have prepared this presentation based on our latest article, as Dan said, in Trends in Organized Crime, together with the first author, Israel Alvarado Martínez. So the idea is that people can understand what is going on in Mexico with the infiltration of drug cartels in this form of wildlife trafficking. Okay. So this presentation will be divided in two parts. Basically, first, I will try to answer why organized crime groups in Mexico, in particular Mexican drug cartels, have been able to infiltrate in this illegal business. And I will do so by focusing on how the different power dynamics, in particular the ones between the state and organized crime groups, throughout the years, we will see the evolution, have influenced the shift in operations of these organized crime groups. I will also explore the conceptualization of organized crime in Mexico, and also present the discussions surrounding why this diversification of organized crime groups into the illegal wildlife trade is taking place. So we will explore a question of, is this adaptation only the result of a process of risk calculation, or rather this infiltration is also embedded in the social context in which organized crime operates. And then in the second part, I will present our empirical findings in relation to the ways in which these organized crime groups adapt to the totoaba swim bladder trafficking by identifying the different interactions between actors that are found along the trafficking chain. And finally, I will wrap up the presentation with the conclusion. Okay, so all the data is extracted from the first author, from Israel Alvarado Martínez, from interviews and literature review and official documents of the Mexican state. Next, please. So first of all, I would like to stress that we are not looking here for the typical factors that explain the emergence of organized crime in Mexico, like high levels of corruption, poverty, geopolitical factors, etc. So rather, the point is to understand why these groups infiltrate into new illicit markets. So that's why we will focus on the evolution of organized crime phenomenon in Mexico, with special emphasis in the dynamics between the state and the Mexican organized crime groups. This is in addition to other factors like major political changes that take place in Mexico, like the transition from one party state to a system of competition between different parties, and how this has influenced the current state of organized crime in Mexico. Here we can see how, since the partial capture of the state, which is the period that goes between 1990 and 2006, organized crime groups emerged from former crime structures that were mainly dedicated to heroin trafficking or marijuana trafficking to the US. That was the case, for instance, of the Guadalajara cartel. And then these new emerging groups consolidated. So from the Guadalajara cartel, this was the case, for instance, that merged the Sinaloa cartel of El Chapo Guzman, or the Tijuana Arellano Felix organization that engaged also, we see already a process of diversification to other serious crimes like kidnapping, robbery, or extortion. Then we see that with Felipe Calderon, after 2006, the state applies a punitive strategy in the form of war on drugs. And this leads to high levels of violence between the state and organized crime groups, but also it started internal wars inside these drug cartels that were like some sort of complex federal organizations for the control of certain illicit markets. No? There's a strong competition between them. This was the case of the Sinaloa cartel when El Chapo Guzman was in prison. And as a result, we can see that organized crime becomes more localized, polymorphous, and small scale, more violent, of course. And thus, they are prone, or they are likely to infiltrate in new illicit markets. Next, please. So another important issue is to consider the concept of organized crime. Even though academics and or the United Nations try to conceptualize organized crime, this is a very contested and ambiguous concept, and is likely to be interpreted differently in each country. And this can lead to certain factors like legal loopholes, criminal procedural law, lack of regulation, different factors that facilitate opportunities for the infiltration of organized crime groups into new illicit markets. New illicit markets like environmental markets, or like wildlife trafficking, that were not considered as serious organized crime previously. For instance, in Mexico, there is a closed list, a numerous clausus list detailing all the activities considered as organized crime. Thus, totoaba trafficking, in particular, was not considered organized crime until 2017. In addition, Mexico considers organized crime as a national security issue, with all the consequences that this has in terms of militarization of the phenomenon, the advent of violence to these fishing areas, etc. Next, please. So when discussing why organized crime groups adapt to new illicit markets, it is mostly argued that this is due to a process of risk calculation. No? There low risk of being caught, high profits involved. However, from this study, we can see that small-scale drug traffickers from the fishing towns of San Felipe and Santa Clara in the north of Mexico, close to the border with California. These drug traffickers, or these small crime structures that emerge after the process of decentralization and internal wars within big drug cartels from the 90s, they are shifting their operations as a result of the social context in which they are operating. They also own to this process of decentralization one of the most common features, which is the high levels of violence they have because they compete each other for the control of the markets. And this is consistent with another case in Mexico, for instance, of the Knights Templar, a group that emerged from the Familia Michoacana and infiltrated in illegal iron mining, as Fausto Carvajal Glass explained in a conference last year, also in the Organized Crime 24 Hours. So finally, as we are going to see, this diversification is explained because they can make these groups, these small-scale drug traffickers, they can make use of their established routes, methods, ties abroad, ties with corrupt officials, alliances with other criminal networks, of course, the embeddedness in their legitimate business and corruption. So now we're going to take a look on how these groups have actually infiltrated in the trafficking chain, in which stages of the totoaba swim bladder trafficking. So next, please. So for the second part of the presentation, I'll be looking at the different stages in a simple division of stages into poaching, trafficking, retail. Why do we explore these stages? Well, because in this way we can address better, first, the different circumstances in which actors are interconnected along the supply chain. We can see the settings, different settings along the supply chain. And second, we can identify the ways in which these drug cartels infiltrate into this new illicit market. Next, please. So the poaching takes place in the upper Gulf of California, in the area we see in the map. Sorry, around the fishing towns of San Felipe and Santa Clara. During the poaching stage, totoaba moths or totoaba swim bladders are sourced both by independent local fishermen and fishermen recruited by organized crime groups. We see that local fishermen use the same fish, the same trolling nets they use for shrimps, whereas poachers use large mesh gill nets. They're called totaberas. They're sort of screen nets they put on the bottom of the sea. The modus operandi involves launching boats from remote beaches at night with small crews from 5 to 7 poachers. Poachers remove the swim bladder at sea and hide them in secret compartments in the boat. In the case they are detected, they show the legal permits to the authorities. Next, please. But most importantly is this pyramid we are seeing here of the interaction between the different actors. First, drug traffickers outsource or delegate the poaching activity to local fishermen by providing finance for equipment, for boats, for nets, etc. Fishermen and poachers also interact with officials, and here officials disclose information in exchange of bribery, but a higher level of corruption takes place between organized crime groups and high-ranking corrupt officials. In addition, violence, extortion, kidnapping are also manifested in the fishing areas, among drug dealers themselves because of strong competition, and against NGOs, of course, against sea shepherd that patrols the sea, and against, of course, state actors that, for instance, ask for too many briberies or are against corrupt practices. Next, please. So after the poaching states, totoaba most are trafficked towards Asia, mainly China. In many cases, transiting through the US. Throughout the whole trafficking chain, always high levels of corruption are involved, and violence, specifically in Mexico. Within Mexico, we can see that totoaba bladders are transported to a consolidation point, and narcotic retailers use their established routes, like the route which goes from San Felipe towards the border major towns close to California. They may also use the same concealment methods as in drug trafficking, like in spare tires, inside vehicles, in hidden compartments, etc. In addition, they use their legitimate business to conceal the most in coolers, among other fish or seafood products. Next, please. Then the totoamos are handed over at this point to ethnic Chinese middlemen, and interestingly, the next nodes of the trafficking chain are controlled by Chinese criminal networks, and the role of Mexican narcotic traffickers is just a collaboration with these Asian networks. At this point, the most interesting thing is that the supply chain is really embedded in legitimate business like restaurants, etc. Next, please. In the case of trafficking across the Pacific, we can see that most of the bladders go to China via Hong Kong, but also it has been detected other countries like Vietnam or Japan. The trafficking is done via air or sea with a misdeclaration as other products, or concealed among other seafood products, or inside luggage through mules. Again, there is a strong connection with the restaurant and seafood industry, and traffickers move totoamos through a network informal connection to trusted end customers. However, we can also see the involvement of the dark web, the social media platforms, and online marketplaces as an inclusive way to connect demand and supply. Next, please. So in conclusion, by examining the evolution of the organized crime phenomenon in Mexico, we've seen that organized crime groups are not only attracted by high profits and low risk of being caught when infiltrated into specific stages, as we saw, of the illegal wildlife trade. In fact, the infiltration takes place because these groups are embedded in the social context in which they particularly operate. Therefore, its diversification of the criminal portfolio is better understood as a result of the interaction between the state on one side and organized crime groups on the other side. In relation to the second question, to how they have infiltrated, well, empirical findings have shown that they outsource the poaching activity in exchange of providing finance for equipment, for instance, for nets, for boats. They may also, these Mexican drug cartels, outsource the smuggling activity within Mexico through mules. They also infiltrate by using their pre-existing smuggling routes of drugs, as well as the same concealment methods, and by means of violence and corruption. So we can see there is a high degree of infiltration within poaching and smuggling stages within Mexico, the smuggling activity. But empirical data shows that further stages within the supply chain, the trafficking from Mexico to the US, across the Pacific, is managed by Asian criminal networks. So the involvement of Mexican drug cartels is zero. And in these further stages of from Mexico to the US, from the US to China, is where profits may be higher as totoamos advance across borders. Next, please. So that was it. Thank you very much for your time, and hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you so much, Aitor, for this very important, great presentation. I see there's one question, but I suggest to keep this question until the end and to continue with the second presentation. The second presentation is also about the role of organized crime in the illegal trade in wildlife. But this one is not in particular about fish, but rather about wildlife products that are being used by Chinese organized crime groups, are trafficked and transferred by organized crime from China. What we see is that in recent years, Chinese crime groups are said to be major players in more organized forms of this trade. And this particular presentation examines the involvement of Chinese organized crime groups in the trade in wildlife in the borderlands of the so-called Golden Triangle. That is actually the point where Laos, Myanmar, Burma, and northern Thailand, and actually also the southern part of China meet each other. I will discuss in this presentation the representation of Chinese crime groups in the illegal wildlife trade by looking at A, the diversification of these crime groups into wildlife crimes, and B, the outsourcing of activities to local opportunistic crime groups in the neighboring Laos and Myanmar countries. And I will conclude that different representations of the Chinese crime groups overseas involved in the illegal wildlife trade are very important into understanding the increasing role of organized crime in the illegal trade in wildlife. So what we see in the past 30 years is that China has experienced, of course, a rapid growth of global criminal markets, including gambling, human trafficking, drugs, but also wildlife smuggling, providing a fertile soil for criminal organizations. Especially Chinese growing worldwide economic and political influence also not only facilitates legitimate activities, but also illegitimate activities by Chinese crime groups. And this enabled, enabled by Chinese economic growth in the 90s and 2000s, we see that there is a new class of Chinese entrepreneurs, of Chinese underground crime networks that are looking across the borders to the Golden Triangle area in search of economic opportunities, but also political power. And they invest in major constructions, infrastructure projects, but also in trade, including illegal trade in the neighboring countries, Laos and Myanmar. And to gain access to land and local resources, some Chinese business networks, some of them links to triads, have partnered with local groups, local crime groups or local armed groups that made their land available in return for a share of profits that will in return strengthen their authority or what they consider their territory or their region where they're active. The presentation is based on empirical data from both Rebecca Wong and the second co-author and my ethnographic fieldwork and analysis of Chinese court judgments on wildlife traders and smugglers arrested in southern China and coming from Laos and Myanmar. And we collected in total 56 cases that occurred between 2010 and 2020 of wildlife smugglers arrested in China. And based on these judgments, we see that 80% of the judgments were from smuggling cases that occurred from Myanmar into China, while around 20% were from Laos into China. And in addition to understand in a better way the qualitative perspective, the contextualization of the region, fieldwork has been conducted across Laos, Myanmar, China, and northern Thailand between 2011 and 2019. Can I have the first sheet, please, of the presentation? Okay, so what we see here on the figure on the right, this illustrates actually the fieldwork region. So we see here important hubs places where field work took place, all in this particular area of the Golden Triangle. So we see on the left, we see Myanmar, on the right Laos, below Thailand, and up we see China. Next sheet, please. So to understand how those organized crime groups diversify into new markets, this figure illustrates with the big arrow on the left that it points to the diversification of organized crime group X. They're going from this group enters a new market. On the right in the circle, and they outsource different illegal activities to localized crime groups A, B, and C, as illustrated by the 3 small arrows on the right. For example, a crime group involved in the trade in tiger skins, they may outsource the tasks of poaching, product promotion, or product delivery to local crime groups. Next sheet. So what we see is that the empirical results show that diversification takes place in several different crime groups. For example, illustrated by a legal judgment of 2019, we see that 2 Chinese offenders worked in collaboration with 2 others in Myanmar to smuggle illegal commodities into China. They checked into a hotel where they paid a Chinese crime group to smuggle 9 tiger skins into China that evening. And having done so, they returned the next day and were asked to smuggle a bag of weapons and drugs into China, which reflects, of course, crime convergence. And indeed, 2 informants in the border area of Myanmar and China, we see, for example, in villages such as Daluo, Mongla, and Kiengtong, that young adults are driving back and forth on their motorcycles via shortcuts in the forest between China and Myanmar. And they complained that their friends have been arrested for drug smuggling. And some of those smugglers have now become active in trading elephant skins, ivory, pangolin scales, and beer products, mainly for traditional Chinese medicine. Other informants explained also that smuggling wildlife products became actually hot products on the market because of a relatively high value, but also because high repressive activities by the local governments or by local militia groups that are in place there, which makes it more attractive to become involved in illegal trading wildlife. And this is also reflected by a conversation with 2 tiger traders. They explained how traders in Mongla invested their money made from the opium trade into wildlife businesses. So they actually diversify from, in this case, drugs into wildlife trafficking because of economic and political, but also social reasons. And the diplomatic relations in such areas may help such organized crime groups a lot with smuggling wildlife across the border. And this can be traced back to political ties between local governments, militia groups, and also crime groups that are all the time interacting with each other, facilitating structures to smuggle wildlife across specific routes or make specific smuggling activities actually immune for reactions of the local governments. But also that drug groups are being used by wildlife traffickers to smuggle it across the borders because of more priorities on specific forms of wildlife trade. For example, in Botan, the border of Laos with China, we see that illegal trade in rhino horn parts has become more difficult for local traffickers. And the difficulties surrounding the rhino horn trade provided actually opportunities for diversification, according to imported wildlife traders in town. So you see the drug trafficking networks are used to smuggle larger scales of wildlife trade nowadays. And this connection with drug trafficking was also illustrated by legal judgments, where we see that crime groups involved in smuggling rhino horn and ivory across the border, that we see that, for example, the logistics company that was being used for this specific case, that they were also being connected to the trade in methamphetamine. And this shows altogether how socioeconomic, political, but also ecological circumstances may affect diversification in the borderlands of the Golden Triangle. In addition, we see that Chinese organized crime groups that diversified into wildlife trade in Laos and in Myanmar established new relationships with local entrepreneurs. So informants explained that ethnic Chinese locals often develop relationships with those new crime groups members established in place in order to foster exchange and collaboration. And this is seen in relation to, for example, as we've also seen with the case of the totoaba with the poaching. So also our empirical data shows that even though many wildlife poachers cannot be directly defined as members of organized crime groups, poaching is being outsourced, as some groups of poachers are being hired by Chinese crime groups. And poachers in Xi'an state, in Myanmar or in Laos, explain that groups of poachers are paid in advance, provided with poaching equipment, and gradually establish a more powerful position in the local political economy. And even though the link to organized crime groups is not always clear in the legal judgments, we see that in some cases, a very high level of organization is behind it, which indicates, of course, more organized networks. For example, one case from 2015 shows how 3 perpetrators smuggled wildlife worth a lot of US dollars, around 100,000 US dollar, and that the wildlife was purchased in Myanmar and was approved by one Chinese defendant who used WeChat videos to teach smugglers how to distinguish specific species. So from that point of view, the Chinese defendant made bank transfers to smugglers who then paid the Burmese poachers through an intermediary. But if you look at the structures based on the information with people directly involved in the illegal trade, based on interviews with them, we see that those structures are actually a lot of them are well organized and paid in advance, arranged in advance with many people involved simultaneously. So in relation to outsourcing, I think it is important to keep in mind that we can see here new criminal careers, because local opportunistic crime groups that were first, for example, being employed by Chinese organized crime groups to do the poaching job or to do the smuggling groups are growing. So they establish their own organized crime group or their own criminal group. And after a while, you see that those individuals may have a network of collaborators with them and establish their own agreement with own power, with their own power and own economic decisions to be made. So to conclude, this presentation illustrates actually the different representations of Chinese organized crime groups involved in wildlife trade abroad, so overseas, in the borderlands of Golden Triangle. And our data in particular shows that the diversification of Chinese crime groups into the illegal wildlife trade in Laos and Myanmar has been influenced by socio-economic but also political changes. So improved trading conditions and infrastructures, as well as social relationships between criminal entrepreneurs established, for example, in China already before the emergence of those Chinese organized crime groups. For example, they went there because of economic opportunities to establish small-scale businesses, and then can be facilitators in the illegal trade in wildlife after a while by establishing new social relationships. But also that the economic opportunities that are provided by the diversification are also facilitated by cross-border trafficking of other contrabands infrastructures, as we've seen with the case of Laos into China. The Golden Triangle, where our empirical research took place, is of course also known for the embeddedness of drugs, in particular opium and methamphetamine, in the local political economy. So therefore, actors involved in illegal wildlife trade in this specific region are regularly associated to other crimes, in particular drugs, where drug lines are used or where combined shipments take place. And some criminal entrepreneurs also invested in casinos in the border areas. And this also facilitated lucrative illegal wildlife trade deals alongside drug trafficking and prostitution in the areas around casinos, but also illegal wildlife trade in some of the casinos in the Golden Triangle area. Another example of diversification that we mentioned is that highly professional smuggling gangs have become involved in both drugs and wildlife smuggling. The drug smuggling groups added wildlife trafficking into their criminal portfolio and used their drug smuggling infrastructure to diversify due to, for example, repressive drug policies or the rising value of wildlife trade. Keep in mind that a rhino horn can be sold on the black market for several thousands of euros, sometimes 30 to 40,000 US dollar or euro even. Another example of diversification is when powerful people use their drug trafficking profits to invest in illegal wildlife trade. So some of the cases also illustrates that actually the money coming from that was being used to invest in illegal wildlife trade was made out of drug trafficking in the region. And in addition, our empirical results show also the importance of knowledge, risk calculation, and criminal careers in the context of outsourcing illegal activities to local crime groups. Our research shows how organized crime groups operate in the local setting and collaborate with local crime groups. So they are socially embedded in new networks that result in new crime groups, fluid networks. And multiple examples illustrate how Chinese crime groups pay local poachers in both money and equipment, because local poachers have the hunting skills to find high-valued wildlife species in the middle of the jungle, but also in relation to outsourcing of smuggling, where wildlife trade is smuggled by local smuggling entrepreneurs. Can be low-level smugglers, for example, the guys on the motorcycles crossing the border into China that I mentioned at the border point of Daluo and Mongla, but it can also be with the help of diplomatic immunity, with government cars are being used or backed up by militia groups that are in place in specific areas along the border of China. However, oftentimes local entrepreneurs only receive a fraction of the profits. If we see in the judgment the amount being paid to the smuggling networks, for example, is only a small part of the real profits that in the end are being made by the networks. So further research into how these networks are socially embedded and how they revolve issues of risks and trust is really important for improving our understanding of diversification and outsourcing. But at least our study reflects well how you have to understand the local perception of those crime groups, the local representation, to understand the diversification of organized crime in the past, now, but also in the near future. That was my last point and my last slide. So thank you so much. Now we move on to our final presentation, which will be more focused on the reactions actually to organized crime forms involved in wildlife trade, but in particular in relation to fisheries. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. Could someone please show the, yeah. Thank you. It is an honor to present at this panel together with Daan and Aitor. I learned a lot from both presentations today. My name is Andrea Stefanus. I was a PhD candidate at the Utrecht University, and I'm currently working with the Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, dealing with transnational organized crime issues. I will base my presentation on my article titled Fishery Business, Regulatory and Enforcement Challenges of Transnational Organized IUU Fishing Crimes. It was published in Organized Crime June this year. This article was written by me and John Perpala. John is a professor. Then I will deliver my presentation also on behalf of John. Next slide, please. The main question of the article is, how can the criminalisation of IUU fishing, especially when committed by OCGs, organized criminal groups, under suppression conventions, tackle the deficits of regulation and enforcement at the international and national levels? We argue that suppression conventions at global and regional levels could serve as solutions to supplement the deficits. In explaining the argument, first we examine the phenomenon of IUU fishing and its TOC dimensions, and also the significant harms caused by IUU fishing, decisions of international and national fisheries instruments to establish the deficit. And then we elaborate why suppression conventions are the suitable solutions to the deficit. And lastly, we analyze how suppression convention can be regulated both at global and regional levels in a way that they tackle the deficits. These steps will be explained in the following slides. Next slide, please. It was estimated that IUU fishing accounts for 11 to 26 million tons of fish each year. And this condition has been escalating for the past 20 years. The US Coast Guard estimates that 1 in 5 fish caught around the world could have originated from IUU fishing. The increasing trend of IUU fishing has made the UN General Assembly recognize it as one of the greatest threats to fish stocks and marine ecosystems. The issue of IUU fishing is also acknowledged by Southeast Asian countries, where they underline that IUU fishing is a serious concern and threatens the sustainability of the region's fisheries management and conservation measures, fishery resources, and aquatic ecosystem, as well as economic viability and food security. Next slide, please. Yeah, so IUU fishing activities have resulted in harms to the economic, social, environmental, and legal order aspects. In terms of economic harms, it is estimated that globally, IUU fishing costs 10 to 23 billion dollar per year. Numerous regions and states also have suffered economic loss from IUU fishing. This economic loss could disrupt the development agenda, particularly when the countries are heavily dependent on the fisheries sector. Next slide. On the environmental harms, IUU fishing is obviously detrimental since conservation and management measures are being disregarded. The activity places tremendous strain on the already depleted fish stocks and seriously affects the efforts to rebuild them. IUU fishing also has detrimental impacts on the marine ecosystem. The depletion of fish stocks and sea creatures can impact the biodiversity and structure of the marine ecosystem. Further, those who carry out IUU fishing often employ destructive fishing methods, which could damage sensitive marine habitats, such as coral reefs. In terms of social harms, the existence of IUU fishing activities can displace legitimate fishers, since IUU fishing operates at lower costs, which leads to unfair competition. The lower fish catch also could disrupt the livelihood of legitimate fishermen, lead to lower employment and lower household incomes, which contributes to the increasing level of poverty. Thus, IUU fishing is, in this sense, provoking a culture of crime and non-compliance. On the legal harms, IUU fishing undermines the legal order by violating fisheries laws and regulations at different levels. IUU fishing actors also often engage in illicit collaboration with corrupt law enforcement officials to avoid the reach of applicable laws and regulations, and to exploit the weak regulations and enforcement in different countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, now we are talking about IUU fishing and TOC. The TOC dimensions can be found through the involvement of OCGs in large-scale IUU fishing operations. They are particularly apparent in the high-value fish products, such as abalone, shark fins, sturgeon, caviar, totoaba, and European eel. Of course, Aitor can talk more on the totoaba and European eels. A high profit margin is one of the main pull factors of these OCGs. For example, 1 kilogram of raw abalone costs about $40 in South Africa and sells for as much as almost $4,000 for retail customers in Asia. Studies of totoaba trafficking in Mexico to China and also European glass eel to Asian market have also shown the indication of OCG's involvement in the trafficking of the two species. In Southeast Asia, specifically, the involvement of OCGs is also evident from numerous cases in the region. For example, the case of the fishing vessel Viking, among others, showed how the vessel operation had the characteristics of OCGs. The vessel had been engaging in IUU fishing activities in different countries for 10 years under 12 different names and 8 different flags before it was sunk by the Indonesian government in 2016. Both transnational and organized crime dimensions magnify the already significant harms of IUU fishing and thus pose major challenges for the international community. However, we found that the existing international and national fisheries instruments have deficits in their regulatory and enforcement designs and practices, as will be explained in the next slide. Next slide, please. Our article examines 5 international fisheries instruments: the UNCLOS, the Compliance Agreement, the UNFSA, IPOA, and the PSMA. These international fisheries instruments only provide general guidelines for enforcement systems and sanctions. These instruments do not have a preference on which enforcement system should be applied by states. Thus, states have wide discretion in designing and applying their enforcement system, which can be administrative, civil, or criminal. This divergent national regulation and enforcement systems and practices could be exploited by IUU fishing actors, including by operating in jurisdiction with the least punitive sanctions, so their operation can continue without significant barriers. Further, international fisheries instruments do not consider at all the TOC dimensions, particularly OCG's involvement in their provisions. They are directed more towards regular actors of IUU fishing. Well, this is understandable since the attention of OCG's involvement is relatively recent in 2008. And it was not a determining factor in the establishment of these instruments. The wide discretion and also the lack of TOC dimension in the international fisheries instruments are also found at the national level in different countries, including in our research in Indonesia and Vietnam. Next slide, please. So we argued that the harms caused by OCGs in IUU fishing are greater than those generated by regular actors of IUU fishing, such as regular fishermen or fishing companies. This amplification of harms is argued to be a qualifying condition for the intervention of states through criminal law in protecting the environment. In this case, the use of criminal law and its sanction is more preferable than civil or administrative law based on four main reasons. First, the application of criminal law shows higher societal disapproval than that would be shown by civil or administrative law. Second, the sanctions of criminal law can be more severe and serve as a deterrent. Third, criminal law authorizes the use of special investigative methods, which is something that cannot be achieved by civil or administrative law. And fourth, criminal law enables the use of international cooperation mechanisms such as MLA and extradition that are generally not used by civil or administrative law. Since criminalization of IUU fishing conducted by OCG is argued as necessary, we suggest that such criminalization can be done through suppression conventions. So the question is, what are suppression conventions, right? Next slide, please. Well, Boyster defined suppression conventions as multilateral treaties that oblige states to criminalize certain forms of conduct and to provide legal assistance to other states in order to suppress treaty crimes or treaty of international concern. In general, suppression convention can be considered to have four main elements: substantive law, jurisdiction, investigative tools, and international cooperation. One of the main objectives of suppression convention is to criminalize certain harmful transnational conduct, in this case, IUU fishing. This study argues that there are several common factors that can be considered in determining whether a conduct should be criminalized under a suppression convention, such as significant harms and the TOC dimensions. These factors are common factors that can be found in numerous suppression conventions. As shown above, as shown in the previous slides, IUU fishing is causing significant harm for states, and it also has clear TOC dimension. Thus, we argue that IUU fishing fits the criteria to be criminalized under suppression conventions. Such as criminalization can be done at global and regional level. Next slide, please. At the global level, we propose three options. First is to criminalize IUU fishing under the UNTOC, which can take the form as serious crime and additional protocol. Second is to establish a standalone suppression convention against IUU fishing. And third, integrating suppression provisions into the existing international fisheries instruments. We recommend that the criminalization of fishing at the global level is best to be done through the first option, which is under the UN-TOC, based on three categories: scope of application, visibility, and operationality. Okay, next slide, please. At the regional level, in this case in Southeast Asia, we propose two options. First is to establish a standalone regional suppression convention and to integrate suppression convention provisions into the existing regional fisheries instruments. We recommend to take the first option as the best option. We can explore further in the discussion why these options are the ones that we recommend. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we have discussed about the criminalization at global and regional level. We argue that to achieve greater success, regional criminalization could serve as a complementary solution to the global criminalization of fishing. For example, in the case of ASEAN, as all the ASEAN member states are parties to the UN-TOC, in this context, the standalone regional convention could serve as a complementary solution to the UN-TOC. However, it should also be acknowledged that there's a possibility that global criminalization cannot be realized and that regional criminalization is the only option. In this case, we think that the absence of global criminalization would not lessen the value of regional criminalization. Next slide, please. Okay, finally, it's come to the conclusion. For this article, we come up with three conclusions. First, organized criminal groups' involvement in fishing is evident and could magnify the harms caused by fishing. Second, there are two proposed solutions, which is criminalization of fishing through suppression conventions at global and or regional levels. And third, both global and regional criminalization would not replace or undermine the existing fisheries instruments. Rather, the global and regional criminalization would complement the existing fisheries instruments. That is all for my presentation. Thank you for your time, and I look forward for further discussion.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for this excellent presentation. I suggest to look first in the chat if there are. I remember there's at least one question for Aitor. Yes, I see it here. Aitor, could you please elaborate on this particular question? How are the proceeds moving? Are they using black market foreign exchange, underground banking, for example? So maybe you could tell us a bit more about the exchanges in relation to the proceeds, in relation to money, how it works, for example, in the context of poachers and the relationship with the Asian networks that are buying the totoaba, or the poachers and between other crime groups in the area?
Thank you, John, for your question. We haven't concretely examined the illicit financial flows within this particular illegal trade of totoaba swim bladder. The paper in Trends in Organized Crime is more about the phenomenon of the diversification of organized crime group into specific stages, but we have other similar cases that suggests that they use the Chinese hawala through 1C connections, meaning that debts from one country are compensated in another country through a network of informal connections and informal banking system. How it works? Well, you go to a shop and you need cash, Mexican pesos or American dollars, to pay the organized group, the crime groups that are behind the poachers and smugglers, and subsequently these organized crime groups pay with this cash that comes from this informal network to the poachers and the smugglers. For example, in Europe, there was discovered in an Interpol operation how Chinese networks move large amounts of cash from Europe to China by train through different nodes through Russia and Central Asia. But yeah, it would be interesting to examine because, for instance, in the illegal trade in European glassils, in the babies that go from Europe to China, I discovered that some glass seals, some poachers, the network paid the poachers with gold. Where this gold came from? I saw that this gold came either from the informal network or from the importers in Hong Kong and China, which are embedded in large multinational companies with satellite business, not only in retail or seafood industry, which is the one that controls the international routes, the legitimate business supply chain, but also they are embedded. They have satellite business in luxury products like jewelry or gold that they are also embedded an illicit financial flows and movement of gold. They also have even luxury tourism business sector. So yeah, it's something that it would be interesting to look at in the particular case of the totoaba. Okay.
Thank you, Aitor. Dear John, does this answer your question, or do you have do you have an additional question?
I send you in the chat a link to the PDF. This is a case study that you can download it from Traffic, and it's a case study that examines different ways in which illicit financial flows are taking place in relation to wildlife trafficking and forest crimes. It's very interesting. I think also, Dan, you've done something on this also, no? A different market.
Yes,
trade.
maybe what I can add is indeed that you see that some of the networks involved in wildlife trade, they use a very complex scheme of money transfer. So the money can go from one country to another country to another country to another country, and in the end arrives at the bank account of a specific person involved. But also, in particular, in relation to in our case study in the Golden Triangle, what we see is that the casinos facilitate also all forms of money transfers, including money laundering. So wildlife trade deals are being made, for example, in casinos, but also some particular actors in the casinos itself can facilitate all kind of transactions. And in addition to that, I understand from Aitor the role of gold. Indeed, it's also good to think about, well, sometimes there are no financial economic flows in terms of money, but it is based on exchange, for example, for gold or from other valuable contrabands. It can also be an exchange between two forms of contraband to avoid the financial money system at all. Are there any other questions? Because I don't see at the moment in the chat other questions. So please, you could raise your hand or include a question in the chat.
Can panelists also ask questions?
Yes, of course. So Andrea, I think, yeah.
If there is,
go ahead.
Yeah, so interesting. From your research, Dan and Aitor, what do you think about the legislation in China and in Mexico regarding the organized criminal groups? Are they sufficient or are they lacking? And I'm just wondering if you cross on the legislation on both countries. Thank you.
Aitor.
Yeah, well, in particular in Mexico, I already said something about it in the presentation. The thing in Mexico is organized crime is only listed in a numerous clauses list. The different types of organized crime phenomenon. So we didn't have any forms of environmental crimes, specifically wildlife trafficking, until 2017, including this list. And in terms of tackling the phenomenon, in terms of combating this, if this is not considered as organized crime, it's considered as a minor issue, obviously they cannot combat it properly. And in case of China, it's also because this issue is transnational. No, it goes to the U.S. through the U.S. to China, but the main problem is Hong Kong works as a transit hub, not only for totoaba swim bladders, but also for lots of other products, not only wildlife, but other illicit financial flows, also other commodities. So the issue here is to see which framework at international level, at conventional level, might work to tackle this issue, right?
Yeah, I fully agree with this. So in general, you see, if you compare wildlife trade to other serious crimes, there are low priorities, they are unregulated, they are being considered as minor issues in a lot of jurisdictions. And of course, this is also one of the causes for diversification, because criminal groups are aware of this, and they see, in that sense, in the context of law asymmetries, that specific regions are extremely attractive for wildlife trade, but also in relation to repressive policies regarding other serious crimes, it can be a nice new way to enter new markets. So basically, I indeed agree with Aitor in this sense that the criminal law dimension, you see that increasingly countries are trying to adopt it into their criminal law policies, but still, in comparison to other serious crimes, it's really underdeveloped.
Thank you. Interesting. I will take a note of your opinions. Thanks.
And dear Andrea, could you please elaborate a bit further on the point of you had different options actually. Why in the end you and John, together with John Vervalen, decided to recommend option 1?
Yes, of
Maybe
course.
we could return to one of your last slides.
Yeah, of course. You mean it's for the global level? Is that correct?
Indeed.
Okay. Yeah. So because the lack of time, I skipped the explanation. But basically, we assess the 3 options based on 3 categories: scope of application, feasibility, and operationality. In terms of the scope of application, we know that member states of the UNTOC have already agreed on the limitation under Article 3, right? Which requires the involvement of OCDs and the element of transnationality in the offense. States can then focus on other substantive aspects of IUU fishing, such as determining which offenses would be criminalized, and then the jurisdictions on different areas, such as international and internal and territorial waters, the exclusive economic zones, high seas and ports, and the additional investigative tools, such as aerial surveillance. In terms of feasibility, the UNTOC also has the advantage where states can use the existing substantive foundation and mechanism rather than starting from scratch, like the other, like the second option. In terms of operationality, the UNTOC is also a better alternative, since it already has the existing institutional supports. In this case, the UNODC, which ideally could provide resources in terms of expertise and funding. So yeah, those are the three criteria. Why finally we choose the first option as our recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the clarification, Andrea. I see that unfortunately we only have 1 minute left. So I propose to wrap up our panel of today. Okay, so all other questions, please feel free to contact us. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Aitor, for your great, excellent, really important presentations. And for the audience, please check out the new special edition in Trends of Organized Crime. This month, you will see more articles, but also include our articles based on the presentations of today. Well, I wish you a lovely day and, well, goodbye, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the OC24 podcast. For more talks, have a look at the podcast feed on whichever platform you use. There are loads more to listen to. Video versions of these talks are also available on the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime YouTube channel. If you would like to share these talks around, we ask that you use the hashtag OC24 and let us know what you think. The 24-hour conference on global organised crime is brought to you by the European Consortium of Political Research Standing Group on Organised Crime, the Centre for Information and Research on Organised Crime, the International Association for the Study of Organised Crime, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. For more information, head over to oc24.globalinitiative.net. This has been the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Thanks for listening.